A night at the club. The air inside the veins smelled like ozone, expensive perfume, and the metallic tang of synthetic blood. It was a sensory nightmare for a fledgling vampire still tethered to her own beating heart. Sarah pressed her back against a support pillar of black marble, the cold stone leaching a small amount of heat from her trembling spine. "Steady," Christine whispered, her voice barely a tremor in the bass-heavy thrum of the club. She stood a few inches away, adjusting her leather jacket. To any observer, they were just two more bodies swaying in the neon gloom, but Sarah knew the truth. Christine was the only one holding the leash on her own thirst. "It's too much," Sarah breathed, her eyes darting across the room. The club was a labyrinth of velvet-lined alcoves and tiered dance floors, populated by the beautiful and the damned. Pale, high-cheekboned patrons moved with a predatory grace that made Sarah's skin crawl. Her fangs ached, a dull, throbbing pressure against her gums that she fought to ignore. "Every heartbeat in this room sounds like a drum. I can hear the blood moving through their veins, Christine. It's like a symphony of screams." "Focus on the mission, not the menu," Jeff snapped from his position by the service entrance. He looked haggard, his face pale under the strobe lights. "We find the lead, we get the intel, we leave. We aren't here to feed." Sarah nodded, squeezing her eyes shut for a second to ground herself. "I am Sarah. I am not a monster." She opened her eyes, watching the way a tall, aristocratic figure in the VIP lounge leaned into a partner's neck, not to bite, but to whisper. It was an intimacy that felt inherently violated. This wasn't just a party, it was a hunting ground disguised as a sanctuary. They moved deeper into the throng. The music, a heavy, synthesized industrial beat, seemed designed to mask the sounds of subtle violence. Sarah noticed a waiter carrying a tray of crystal flutes filled with a viscous, crimson liquid. She felt a phantom hunger tear at her throat, a sharp, clawing demand that defied her willpower. She shoved her hands deep into her pockets, clenching her fists until her knuckles turned white. "Keep your head down," Stephanie murmured as she slid past, her eyes scanning the upper tier. "David's people are here. I saw the ring. The silver sigil." Sarah's pulse spiked. The mention of David brought the collapse of the island house back into sharp focus, the falling ceiling, the scream that had been swallowed by the earth, the realization that Rachel had been ripped away from her. The grief was a cold, stagnant pool in her chest, but the anger was a roaring fire. They reached the edge of the central bar, a massive slab of onyx. Sarah leaned over, her peripheral vision picking up movement in the rafters above the dance floor. She saw shadows that moved too quickly, too fluidly, guards. They were watching the crowd with detached, clinical intensity. "Over there," Christine whispered, nodding toward a private booth cordoned off by heavy velvet ropes. Sarah looked. Her breath hitched. Sitting in the center of the booth, flanked by two stone-faced enforcers in immaculate dark suits, was a man whose presence warped the air around him. He wasn't David, but he held the same regal, terrifying arrogance. He was playing with a small, ornate dagger, tracing the edge of his thumb with the blade. He looked bored, his eyes drifting over the writhing bodies on the dance floor as if he were choosing between toys. "That's him," Sarah whispered, her voice thick with sudden, irrational dread. "That's one of Stacy's lieutenants. If he's here, the movement of the recruits, it has to be tonight." "We don't see Rachel," Jeff said, his voice tight. "Don't look for her. If she's here, she's hidden. We wait for the exchange." Sarah tried to pull her eyes away from the lieutenant, but she couldn't. Something about his posture, the way he tilted his head, screamed of dark, ancient magic. This was the world she had been dragged into, a world where the prey were supposed to stay silent while the predators circled. Suddenly, the music shifted, dropping to a low, ominous thrum that vibrated in Sarah's teeth. The dancers parted, moving aside with rhythmic, practiced precision. A path opened from the back of the club, leading toward the VIP section. A figure emerged. At first, Sarah saw only the silhouette, a tall, imposing frame draped in dark, shimmering silk. Then, the strobe lights hit, and the world slowed to a crawl. Walking behind the figure, guided by a heavy silver chain that looked less like a restraint and more like a badge of ownership, was a woman with familiar, haunted eyes. "Rachel," Sarah whispered, the name escaping her lips before she could catch it. Rachel moved with a terrifyingly perfect gait, her head bowed, her expression a mask of porcelain indifference. Gone was the adventurous girl who had joked about island legends. In her place was a hollowed-out vessel, her movements precise and lethal. Even from across the room, Sarah could feel the absence of the soul she had known. David followed a few paces behind, his hand resting possessively on the small of Rachel's back. He was smiling, a thin, cruel line that didn't reach his eyes. He leaned down and whispered something into Rachel's ear. Rachel didn't blink. She didn't flinch. She simply adjusted her course, her eyes scanning the crowd with an emptiness that felt like a death sentence to anyone she looked upon. Sarah felt the world tilt. Her vampiric senses, usually a curse, now amplified the horror of the moment. She could smell the coldness coming off Rachel, the scent of damp earth and stale magic. The transformation had been absolute, but it was the conditioning that made Sarah's heart shatter. "She doesn't know you," Christine gripped Sarah's arm, her fingers digging in hard enough to bruise. "Sarah, listen to me. If you move now, you're dead. And so are we." "She's in there," Sarah hissed, her voice trembling with a mixture of rage and agonizing hope. "I can see it. Look at her hand, the way she twitches her fingers. That's her. That's Rachel." "It's a memory," Jeff whispered, his eyes fixed on David. "Don't mistake the echo for the person. She's their weapon now. Look at how they handle her." David steered Rachel toward the lieutenant in the VIP booth. The crowd swarmed back in, creating a wall of bodies between them and the target. Sarah's gaze remained locked on the spot where Rachel had vanished behind the velvet. Her fangs were fully extended now, cutting into her lower lip, a drop of blood trickling down her chin. She didn't feel the pain. She only felt the singular, burning necessity to tear through every obstacle in this room to reach her friend. "I have to get closer," Sarah whispered, her body coiling like a spring. "Sarah, no," Christine hissed, but Sarah was already moving. She slipped into the crowd, her movements fluid and predatory, mimicking the grace of the others. She kept her gaze fixed on the VIP booth, her mind a battlefield of fractured memories and the cold, unyielding reality of the hunger. Every instinct told her to run, to hunt, to reclaim the piece of herself that was currently wearing the mask of an enemy. She navigated the dancers, her hand grazing the cold marble of the columns. The lieutenant in the booth looked up suddenly, his eyes scanning the crowd with sudden, sharp interest. He stopped his blade play, his head cocking to the side like a hunting hound catching a scent. Sarah stopped dead, blending into the shadow of a pillar. The lieutenant's eyes locked onto the floor where she stood. A slow, predatory smile spread across his face. He leaned over, whispering something to David, whose head snapped around, his eyes scanning the room with frantic, murderous intensity. The club's atmosphere shifted instantly. The music didn't stop, but the vibration changed, the room grew colder, the shadows reaching out from the corners like living things. "They see us," Stephanie whispered, appearing at Sarah's shoulder. "They see me," Sarah corrected, her eyes fixed on Rachel, who remained standing, statuesque and unmoving, while the men around her began to stand. David's hand went to the hilt of a hidden blade at his waist. He looked directly at Sarah, his eyes widening in a mix of surprise and sadistic delight. He beckoned, a slow, mocking gesture that felt like an invitation to a funeral. The hunt was no longer theirs. The predators had turned, and the club was closing in. The bass in the vein wasn't music, it was a rhythmic, subsonic vibration designed to keep the human patrons in a state of suggestible euphoria and the vampires in a constant state of bloodlust. Sarah felt it in her marrow, a low-frequency hum that made her own fangs ache against her lower lip. She kept her head down, masking her scent with the stolen tonic Christine had provided, but the air here was thick, heavy with the iron tang of spilled plasma and the pheromones of apex predators. She looked up. Across the sunken dance floor, beneath the flickering strobe lights that pulsed like a dying heart, David stood on a raised dais. He was dressed in a suit that looked like it had been tailored from shadow, his smile as sharp and serrated as a razor blade. Beside him stood Rachel. Rachel. Sarah's breath hitched, a sharp, ragged sound that she managed to stifle by biting her tongue until the copper taste of her own blood bloomed in her mouth. Rachel wasn't the girl who had teased her about urban legends in the back seat of a car. She was dressed in something utilitarian and cruel, black leather and straps, her skin pale to the consistency of parchment. Her eyes, once a warm, curious hazel, were now flat, vacant mirrors of obedience, staring straight ahead at nothing. "Look at her," David's voice amplified, cutting through the thrum of the club. He wasn't speaking to the room, he was speaking directly to the balcony where Sarah crouched behind a velvet curtain. He knew. He had smelled her the moment she breached the threshold. A perfect vessel. Stripped of the messy sentimentality of a human life. Reborn. He stroked Rachel's cheek. She didn't flinch. She didn't blink. She was a doll, a weapon, a testament to what David could do to someone Sarah loved. "Sarah," Christine whispered, her hand gripping Sarah's arm so tightly her knuckles were white. "Don't. Look at her eyes. That isn't her anymore. Not right now." "She's in there," Sarah hissed, her voice vibrating with a predatory growl she hadn't yet learned to suppress. "I can feel her heartbeat. It's faint, it's terrified, but it's there. If you go down there, you're just serving yourself up as the second course," Jeff muttered, his hand hovering over the silver-infused blade at his hip. "We need the intel on the castle, not a suicide mission." David's gaze locked onto the balcony, his smirk widening. He leaned down and whispered something into Rachel's ear. Rachel turned. Her movement was unnatural, fluid, predatory, and devoid of the nervous fidgets that had always defined her. She looked up at the balcony. Her face was a mask of cold indifference, but for a split second, a micro-expression flickered, a twitch of the brow, a momentary clouding of those hollow eyes. "Kill it," David commanded, his voice casual, as if he were ordering a drink. Rachel didn't hesitate. She vaulted over the railing of the dais, landing with a silent, cat-like grace in the middle of the dance floor. The crowd of revelers parted like water, sensing the sudden shift in atmospheric pressure. She looked up at the balcony, her focus narrowing exclusively on Sarah. "Rachel, stop!" Sarah shouted, abandoning stealth as she stepped out from behind the curtain. The music didn't stop, but the energy in the room shifted. A dozen pairs of yellow, glowing eyes turned toward the balcony. Rachel ignored her, leaping toward the support pillars of the mezzanine with an impossible burst of speed. She scaled the concrete wall like a spider, her fingers digging into the stone. "She's coming for us," Stephanie warned, drawing her crossbow. "Don't hurt her." Sarah lunged forward, grabbing Stephanie's wrist. "She's not in control. If you kill her, you're killing the friend I'm trying to save." "Sarah, she's coming to kill you." Christine shoved Sarah aside just as Rachel cleared the edge of the balcony. Rachel hit the floor of the mezzanine with a bone-jarring thud. She rose slowly, her movements jerky and stiff, like a marionette controlled by a clumsy master. She stood between them and the exit, her hands curling into claws. The skin around her eyes darkened with vein-like bruising, the telltale mark of advanced enthrallment. "Rachel, it's me," Sarah said, stepping forward, ignoring the way her own vampiric instincts urged her to fight back. She exposed her neck, a desperate, reckless gamble. "Look at me. Remember the house? Remember the lake?" Rachel's head tilted. The mechanical motion stopped. Her pupils dilated, searching Sarah's face. For a heartbeat, the predatory tension in Rachel's shoulders evaporated. She took a shuddering step forward, her lips parting as if to form a name that had been scrubbed clean by David's ritual. Sarah. The word was a rasp, a ghost of a voice. David's laughter echoed from the floor below, a cold, mocking sound that shattered the moment. Rachel's face contorted, her expression shifting from recognition to physical agony. She grabbed her own head, her nails digging into her scalp. No, Rachel whimpered, the sound twisting into a guttural snarl. Fight it, Ratch, Sarah pleaded, inching closer. You're stronger than him. You're stronger than all of them. Kill. The traitor, David's voice boomed again, amplified by the dark magic permeating the building. Rachel's posture snapped back into a defensive crouch. The momentary spark of humanity was snuffed out, replaced by a cold, murderous resolve. She hissed, the sound sharp and metallic, and lunged. Sarah dodged, the wind of Rachel's strike whipping through her hair. They collided, the impact throwing them both against a heavy velvet partition. Sarah caught Rachel's wrists, the strength in her friend's arms horrifyingly amplified. They were locked in a stalemate, forehead to forehead, the scent of Rachel's cold, stagnant blood washing over Sarah. I don't want to fight you, Sarah sobbed, pushing back with everything she had. You aren't fighting me, Rachel spat, her voice layered with an unnatural, echoed resonance that wasn't hers. You're fighting the inevitable. Rachel kicked Sarah in the stomach, sending her sprawling across the floor. As Sarah scrambled to regain her footing, she saw Rachel's eyes flare with a sickly, ethereal light, the same dark magic David had used during the ritual. Rachel didn't just want to fight, she was being used as a conduit. Around them, the club was descending into chaos. The other vampires were closing in, sensing a kill. Christine and the others were pinned down near the stairwell, fighting off a swarm of panicked, feral thralls. Sarah stood, wiping a smear of dark blood from her lip. She looked at the exit, then at Rachel, who was stalking toward her with a predatory grace that turned Sarah's stomach. She realized then that she couldn't win this fight by strength alone. She couldn't overpower a shell that had been filled with the concentrated malice of an ancient order. She had to remind her. The mirror. Sarah screamed toward the back of the room, where a massive, antique vanity stood as part of the decor. Rachel didn't understand, but she didn't wait to be told. She launched herself at Sarah, a blur of motion. Sarah didn't fight back, she sidestepped, letting Rachel's momentum carry her toward the glass. Sarah grabbed a heavy brass candelabra from a nearby table, not to strike Rachel, but to smash the reflection. As the glass shattered into 1,000 jagged, glittering shards, Sarah dove for the slivers, catching one in her palm, uncaring of the silver-laced frame that burned her skin. She spun around, catching Rachel by the shoulders and forcing her to look into the fractured, chaotic shards of the mirror. Look at yourself, Sarah yelled, holding the shard up to Rachel's eyes. Look at what they've turned you into. Is this what you wanted? Is this the life you were promised? Rachel froze. She stared into the mirror, but she didn't see the weapon David had forged. She saw the hollow, dead thing she had become. The shock of the realization hit her like a physical blow. She staggered back, the dark light in her eyes flickering violently. Sarah? Rachel's voice was small, terrified. She looked down at her own hands, at the blood that stained her knuckles, blood that wasn't hers. What did I? A screech of rage tore through the room. David, realizing his prize was regaining her autonomy, stepped onto the stairs, his hands glowing with a sickening, necrotic green energy. Enough of this sentiment, David roared. Destroy her, Rachel, or I will unmake you entirely. Rachel screamed, a raw, human sound of pure, unadulterated anguish. She clutched her head as the dark magic began to writhe under her skin, black veins blooming across her throat like ink and water. Run, Rachel gasped, her eyes locking onto Sarah's, a desperate, lucid plea etched into her gaze. Sarah, run. I'm not leaving you. You have to. Rachel pushed Sarah away with a shove that sent her reeling toward the stairwell. They're going to kill us all. Go. Get the others. If you don't go now, everything they're planning, it'll happen anyway. Rachel. Go. Rachel turned to face David, her stance shifting from subservient to defiant. She didn't have a weapon, but as the dark energy swirled around her, she began to draw it into herself, effectively turning her own body into a containment vessel for the magic David was trying to unleash. The floor of the mezzanine began to crack. The subsonic hum of the club turned into a deafening, shrieking frequency. She's overloading, Jeff shouted, dragging Sarah by the collar toward the exit. We have to move. Now. Sarah took one last look at her friend. Rachel stood in the center of the room, her back to the stairs, holding off an army of monsters with nothing but the sheer, tortured force of her will. She wasn't fighting for David anymore. She was holding the line. Sarah didn't want to turn away. The guilt of leaving her was a weight that threatened to crush her, but she saw the glint of understanding in Rachel's eyes, the knowledge that this was the only way any of them were getting out alive. As they burst through the heavy velvet doors and into the cold, damp air of the London night, the building behind them groaned. A shockwave of pure, discordant energy rippled outward, shattering every window on the block. The scream that followed was half human, half monstrous, and entirely Rachel's. Sarah fell to her knees on the pavement, the taste of ash in her mouth. She clutched her chest, feeling a phantom pain where her heart should have been beating. She's still there, Sarah whispered, her eyes fixed on the crumbling structure of the club. She's still in there. Christine knelt beside her, checking the wounds they'd sustained, but Sarah barely felt the sting. The victory of escape felt like the most hollow defeat of her life. She looked at her trembling hands, then up at the dark, uncaring London sky. The war hadn't ended tonight. It had just begun, and the first casualty was the person she had sworn to protect. We have to go, Jeff urged, pulling her up. They'll be swarming this place in minutes. We have the data, Sarah. We know about the castle. We know where Stacy is. Sarah stood, her eyes hardening into cold, unyielding flint. The girl who had gone into the house on the island was gone, replaced by something colder, sharper, and driven by a singular, burning purpose. Let them come, Sarah said, her voice devoid of the tremor that had haunted it moments before. If they want a war, they can have it. But they're going to learn that they shouldn't have taken her. She turned away from the ruins, her pace steady and lethal, leaving the ghosts of the vein behind to burn in the shadows. The rain in London didn't wash away the copper tang of blood, it only thinned it into a slick, shimmering film over the cobblestones. Sarah stood in the shadow of a brick archway, her chest heaving, not from exertion, but from the hunger. It was a rhythmic, pulsing ache behind her ribs, a demand that grew louder every time she inhaled the ozone-heavy air. Beside her, Christine was wiping soot from her tactical vest, her hands trembling. Stephanie and Jeff were hunched over a glowing tablet, their faces illuminated by the harsh blue light of a decrypted map. We shouldn't have left her, Sarah whispered. Her voice sounded strange to her own ears, raspy, like dry leaves skittering over pavement. If we'd stayed, we'd be dead, Sarah, Christine said, not looking up. Look at the intel. The explosion forced their hand. David didn't just move the recruits, he's calling for the transport to the Highlands. The Queen's estate. That's where they're keeping her. Sarah looked toward the blackened, smoldering remains of the vein. The club was a tomb now, but the psychic imprint of what she'd seen inside, Rachel, her eyes glassy and hollow, moving with the predatory grace of a killing machine, burned behind her eyelids. Rachel hadn't just been captured, she had been hollowed out and refilled with something cold. She looked at me, Sarah said, the memory cutting deeper than any blade. She looked right at me, and there was nothing. No recognition. Just target acquisition. She's been compromised at a cellular level, Jeff said, his voice grim as he slid the tablet into his pack. David's rituals aren't just conditioning, they're rewriting the host's personality. Whatever is left of the real Rachel is buried under layers of dark magic. Sarah's fingers clawed into the brickwork, her nails leaving deep, jagged gouges in the mortar. The vampire strength she'd been given, a curse she was still learning to leash, was surging. Then we dig her out. We find the castle, we breach the perimeter, and we bring her back. The castle is a fortress, Sarah, Stephanie said, her voice dropping. We saw the layout. It's not just security, it's a sanctum of blood magic. Even if we get in, how do we handle a legion of them? We aren't just fighting vampires anymore, we're fighting a monarchy. Then we become the insurgency, Sarah snapped. She turned to them, her eyes catching the stray light of a distant street lamp. For a heartbeat, the amber glow was predatory, feral. She caught herself, closing her eyes, forcing her pulse to slow. I'm not leaving her to be the queen's pet. We take the hit to their supply line, we hit the castle, and we end this. Does anyone have a better plan? Silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of the coming war. We need weapons, Christine finally said. Silver nitrate rounds, ultraviolet emitters, and something to dampen that dark magic. If we're going to the Highlands, we need to be ready for an environment that actively wants to kill us. I know a contact, Jeff muttered, looking at the others. An old guy in Soho. He deals in relics. Not the tourist trash, real gear. He might be able to help us with an anchor, something to keep us grounded when the magic gets heavy. Do it, Sarah said. She felt a cold, hard resolve settling in her gut. She had been human once. She had been scared. Now, she was something else, and she would use that something else to tear David's empire down, brick by blood-soaked brick. As they moved through the alleyways, navigating the labyrinth of the city, Sarah felt the lingering presence of the night. Every shadow seemed to reach for her, whispering of blood, of hunger, of the power she could wield if she just let go of her morality. She kept her head down, her gait measured, fighting the instinct to run, to hunt, to give in to the monster. She looked back once, toward the smoking ruin of the club. She didn't expect to see Rachel, but she couldn't help but look. In her mind, she played back the moment of their standoff. The way Rachel had held her blade, not with the clumsy hesitation of a student, but with the efficiency of an executioner. I will save you, Sarah promised, though she knew the Rachel she loved might already be gone. And if I can't, I will make sure the queen dies for what she's done to you. They reached the end of the alley, emerging into a deserted square. Sarah paused, sniffing the air. The scent of ozone and burning synthetic leather hung heavy. A new scent cut through it, a faint, lingering trace of ozone and ancient, rotting earth. Someone's tracking us, Sarah whispered, her hand dropping to the hilt of the blade strapped to her thigh. Christine and the others went still, their training kicking in. They formed a tight defensive circle, facing outward into the gloom. It's not just the vampires, Sarah said, the hairs on her neck standing up. It's that magic. That same cold, suffocating weight I felt near David. Out of the darkness, a figure coalesced, not emerging from behind a wall, but seemingly peeling away from the shadows themselves. It was tall, draped in a coat that seemed to absorb the ambient light. It wasn't David. It was something else. You make a lot of noise for creatures of the night, the figure said. The voice was smooth, cultured, and utterly devoid of warmth. It was Nick's voice, yet warped, the cadence all wrong, echoing with a hollow, subterranean resonance. AJ. Sarah stepped forward, her teeth gritted. We're done playing, AJ. Where is she? The entity in Nick's body tilted its head, a motion that was jarringly fluid. She is exactly where she needs to be. The queen is very fond of her new toy. You are merely a curiosity, Sarah. A failed experiment that thinks it has a soul. I have more than a soul, Sarah hissed, her eyes locking onto his. I have a purpose. Purpose is a human delusion, AJ replied, and with a flick of his wrist, the air in the square erupted. The cobblestones groaned. Shadows surged up like ink, twisting into jagged, sentient shapes. Sarah didn't hesitate. She lunged forward, her speed unnatural, her movements a blur of kinetic energy. She crossed the distance in a heartbeat, her blade aimed for the center of the entity's chest. AJ sidestepped with a grace that was chilling, his hand lashing out to catch Sarah by the throat. He lifted her off her feet with contemptuous ease. "You are strong," he whispered, his eyes glowing with a faint, sickly violet light. "But you are still a prisoner to your memories. You want to save her? Look at the sky, Sarah." He threw her aside, and she slammed into a brick wall, the impact rattling her bones. She scrambled to her feet, gasping, looking up. The clouds above London were parting, swirling into a massive, unnatural vortex that centered over the horizon to the north. Within the swirling dark, lightning flashed, not white or blue, but a deep, bruised purple. It was a beacon, a signal of power so vast it made the air hum with static. "The Queen is preparing," AJ said, his form beginning to shimmer and dissolve back into the shadows. "The Highlands are no longer just a location. They are a catalyst. You think you can infiltrate a castle? You're walking into an altar." He vanished, the laughter echoing in the sudden silence of the square. Sarah stared at the vortex in the sky, her heart hammering against her ribs. The fear was there, cold and sharp, but underneath it, the rage burned brighter than ever. "He's right," Jeff said, breathless. "That's not just a storm. That's a ritual gathering. If she finishes that, she won't need to hunt. She'll just command." Sarah pulled her jacket tight, her jaw set in a line of iron. She looked at her friends, scarred, tired, but still standing. "Then we move now," she said. "We don't wait for gear, we don't wait for better odds. We go to the Highlands. We go to the castle, and we stop this before the sun stops rising for good." As they began to run, the sound of their boots echoing in the empty city, Sarah felt the transformation pushing at the edges of her vision. The world was sharpening, the details becoming visceral, the beat of a stray dog's heart 3 blocks away, the sound of the river, the smell of fear on the wind. She wasn't human. She was a monster, a weapon, and she was going home to war.